had not been going on right. The shopman whispered a word or two across the table to Miss Matty. She looked at him with a dubious air. "Perhaps so," said she, "but I don't pretend to understand business. I only know that if it's going to fail, and if honest people are to lose their money because they have taken our notes, I can't explain myself," said she, suddenly becoming aware that she had got into a long sentence with 4 people for audience. "Only I would rather exchange my gold for the note, if you please," turning to the farmer, "and then you can take your wife the shawl. It is only going without my gown a few days longer," she continued, speaking to me. "Then I have no doubt everything will be cleared up." "But if it is cleared up the wrong way," said I. "Why, then it will only have been common honesty in me as a shareholder to have given this good man the money. I am quite clear about it in my own mind, but, you know, I can never speak quite as comprehensibly as others can. Only you must give me your note, Mr. Dobson, if you please, and go on with your purchase with these sovereigns." The man looked at her with silent gratitude, too awkward to put his thanks into words, but he hung back for a minute or two, fumbling with his note. "I'm loth to make another one lose instead of me, if it is a loss, but you see, £5 is a deal of money to a man with a family, and as you say, 10 to 1 in a day or two, the note will be as good as gold again." "No hope of that, my friend," said the shopman. "The more reason why I should take it," said Miss Matty quietly. She pushed her sovereigns toward the man, who slowly laid his note down in exchange. "Thank you. I will wait a day or two before I purchase any of these silks. Perhaps you will then have a greater choice. My dear, will you come upstairs?" We inspected the fashions with as minute and curious an interest as if the gown to be made after them had been bought. I could not see that the little event in the shop below had in the least damped Miss Matty's curiosity as to the make of the sleeves or the sit of the skirts. She once or twice exchanged congratulations with me on our private and leisurely view of the bonnets and shawls, but I was, all the time, not so sure that our examination was so utterly private, for I caught glimpses of a figure dodging behind the cloaks and mantles, and by a dexterous move I came face to face with Miss Pole, also in the morning costume, the principal feature of which was her being without teeth and wearing a veil to conceal the deficiency, come on the same errand as ourselves, but she quickly took her departure, because, as she said, she had a bad headache and did not feel herself up to a conversation. As we came down through the shop, the civil Mr. Johnson was awaiting us. He had been informed of the exchange of the note for gold, and with much good feelings and real kindness, but with a little want of tact, he wished to condole with Miss Matty, and impress upon her the true state of the case. I could only hope that he had heard an exaggerated rumor, for he said that her shares were worse than nothing, and that the bank could not pay a shilling in the pound. I was glad that Miss Matty seemed still a little incredulous, but I could not tell how much of this was real or assumed. With that self-control which seemed habitual to ladies of Miss Matty's standing in Cranford, who would have thought their dignity comprised by the slightest expression of surprise, dismay, or any similar feeling to an inferior in station or in a public shop. However, we walked home very silently. I am ashamed to say, I believe I was rather vexed and annoyed at Miss Matty's conduct in taking the note to herself so decidedly. I had so set my heart upon her having a new silk gown, which she wanted sadly. In general, she was so undecided anybody might turn her round. In this case, I had felt that it was no use attempting it, but I was not the less put out at the result. Somehow, after 12 o'clock, we both acknowledged to a sated curiosity about the fashions and to a certain fatigue of body, which was, in fact, depression of mind, that indisposed us to go out again. But still we never spoke of the note, till, all at once, something possessed me to ask Miss Matty if she would think it her duty to offer sovereigns for all the notes of the town and county banks she met with. I could have bitten my tongue out the minute I had said it. She looked up rather sadly, and as if I had thrown a new perplexity into her already distressed mind, and for a minute or two she did not speak. Then she said, "My own dear Miss Matty," without a shade of reproach in her voice, "My dear, I never feel as if my mind was what people call very strong, and it's often hard enough work for me to settle what I ought to do with the case right before me. I was very thankful that I saw my duty this morning with the poor man standing by me, but it's rather a strain upon me to keep thinking and thinking what I should do if such and such a thing happened. And I believe I had rather wait and see what really does come, and I don't doubt I shall be helping then if I don't fidget myself and get too anxious beforehand. You know, love, I'm not like Deborah. If Deborah had lived, I've no doubt she would have seen after them before they had gotten themselves into this state. We had neither of us much appetite for dinner, though we tried to talk cheerfully about indifferent things. When we returned into the drawing room, Miss Matty unlocked her desk and began to look over her account books. I was so penitent for what I had said in the morning that I did not choose to take upon myself the presumption to suppose that I could assist her. I rather left her alone, as, with puzzled brow, her eye followed her pen up and down the ruled page. By and by she shut the book, locked the desk, and came and drew a chair to mine, where I sat in moody sorrow over the fire. I stole my hand into hers. She clasped it, but did not speak a word. At last she said, with forced composure in her voice, "If that bank goes wrong, I shall lose £149, 13 shillings, and 4 pence a year. I shall only have £13 a year left." I squeezed her hand hard and tight. I did not know what to say. Presently, it was too dark to see her face. I felt her fingers work convulsively in my grasp, and I knew she was going to speak again. I heard the sobs in her voice as she said, "I hope it's not wrong, not wicked, but, oh, I am so glad poor Deborah is spared this. She could not have borne to come down in the world. She had such a noble, lofty spirit." This was all she said about the sister who had insisted upon investing their little property in that unlucky bank. We were later in lighting the candle than usual that night, and until that light shamed us into speaking, we sat together very silently and sadly. However, we took to our work after tea with a kind of forced cheerfulness, which soon became real as far as it went. Talking of that never-ending wonder, Lady Glenmire's engagement, Miss Matty was almost coming round to think it a good thing. I don't mean to deny that men are troublesome in a house. I don't judge from my own experience, for my father was neatness itself, and wiped his shoes on coming in as carefully as any woman. But still a man has a sort of knowledge of what should be done in difficulties, that it is very pleasant to have one at hand ready to lean upon. Now, Lady Glenmire, instead of being tossed about and wondering where she is to settle, will be certain of a home among pleasant and kind people, such as our good Miss Pole and Miss Forrester. And Mr. Hoggins is really a very personable man, and as for his manners, why, if they are not polished, I have known people with very good hearts and very clever minds too, who were not what some people reckoned refined, but who were both true and tender. She fell off into a soft revere about Mr. Holbrook, and I did not interrupt her. I was so busy maturing a plan I had had in my mind for some days, but which this threatened failure of the bank had brought to a crisis. That night, after Miss Matty went to bed, I treacherously lighted the candle again and sat down in the drawing-room to compose a letter to the aged Jenkins, a letter which should affect him if he wore Peter, and yet seem a mere statement of dry facts if he were a stranger. The church clock pealed out 2 before I had done. The next morning news came, both official and otherwise, that the town and county bank had stopped payment. Miss Matty was ruined. She tried to speak quietly to me, but when she came to the actual fact that she would have but about 5 shillings a week to live upon, she could not restrain a few tears. "I am not crying for myself, dear," said she, wiping them away. "I believe I am crying for the very silly thought of how my mother would grieve if she could know. She always cared for us so much more than for herself, but many a poor person has less, and I am not very extravagant, and thank God, when the neck of mutton and Martha's wages and the rent are paid, I have not a farthing owing. Poor Martha, I think she'll be so sorry to leave me." Miss Matty smiled at me through her tears, and she would fain have had me see only the smile, not the tears. Chapter 14. Friends in Need. It was an example to me, and I fancy it might be to many others, to see how immediately Miss Matty set about the retrenchment which she knew to be right under her altered circumstances. While she went down to speak to Martha and break the intelligence to her, I stole out with my letter to the Aga Jenkins, and went to the Signor's lodging to obtain the exact address. I bound the Signora to secrecy, and indeed her military manners had a degree of shortness and reserve in them which made her always say as little as possible, except when under the pressure of strong excitement. Moreover, which made my secret doubly sure, the Signor was now so far recovered as to be looking forward to traveling and conjuring again in the space of a few days, when he, his wife, and little Phoebe would leave Cranford. Indeed, I found him looking over a great black and red placard in which the Signor Bernoni's accomplishments were set forth, and of which only the name of the town where he would next display them was wanting. He and his wife were so much absorbed in deciding where the red letters would come in with the most effect, it might have been the rubric for that matter, that it was some time before I could get my question asked privately, and not before I had given several decisions, the which I questioned afterwards with equal wisdom of sincerity as soon as the Signor threw in his doubts and reasons on the important subject. At last I got the address, spelt by sound, and very queer it looked. I dropped it in the post on my way home, and then for a minute I stood looking at the wooden pane with a gaping slit which divided me from the letter but a moment ago in my hand. It was gone from me like life, never to be recalled. It would get tossed about on the sea, and stained with sea waves perhaps, and be carried among palm trees, and scented with all tropical fragrance. The little piece of paper, but an hour ago so familiar and commonplace, had set out on its race to the strange wild countries beyond the Ganges. But I could not afford to lose much time on this speculation. I hastened home that Miss Matty might not miss me. Martha opened the door to me, her face swollen with crying. As soon as she saw me, she burst out afresh, and taking hold of my arm, she pulled me in and banged the door to, in order to ask me if indeed it was all true that Miss Matty had been saying. I'll never leave her. No, I won't. I told her so, and said I could not think how she could find in her heart to give me warning. I could not have had the face to do it if I'd been her. I might have been just as good for nothing as Miss Fitzadam Rossi, who struck for wages after living 7 years and a half in one place. I said I was not one to go and serve mammon at that rate, that I knew when I'd got a good missus, if she didn't know when she'd got a good servant. But Martha, said I, cutting in while she wiped her eyes. Don't but Martha me, she replied to my deprecatory tone. Listen to reason. I'll not listen to reason, she said, now in full possession of her voice, which had been rather choked with sobbing. Reason always means that someone else has got to say. Now I think what I've got to say is good enough reason, but reason or not, I'll say it, and I'll stick to it. I've money in the savings bank, and I've a good stock of clothes, and I'm not going to leave Miss Matty. No, not if she gives me warning every hour in the day. She put her arms akimbo, as much as to say she defied me, and indeed I could hardly tell how to begin to remonstrate with her, so much did I feel that Miss Matty and her increasing infirmity needed the attendance of this kind and faithful woman. Well, said I at last, I'm thankful you begin with well. If you'd have begun with but, as you did afore, I'd not have listened to you. Now you may go on. I know you would be a great loss to Miss Matty, Martha. I told her so, a loss she'd never cease to be sorry for, broke in Martha triumphantly. Still, she will have so little, so very little to live upon, that I don't see just how she could find you food. She will even be pressed for her own. I tell you this, Martha, because I feel you are like a friend to dear Miss Matty, but you know she might not like to have it spoken about. Apparently this was even a blacker view of the subject than Miss Matty had presented to her, for Martha just sat down on the first chair that came to hand and cried out loud. We had been standing in the kitchen. At last she put her apron down and, looking me earnestly in the face, asked,